and the general theory is that this was, in fact, ethnic violence being used by the state.
Oui.
And again, as Muller states, little is known about the Kalenjin youth who participated in the violence and the extent to which they responded to pressure or payment or their own prejudices and resentments, unquote. It's again an area that's, as you said in your own evidence, was little known.
Yes, indeed. We know relatively little with regard to the militia at the start of the 90s and the micro-local factors which made certain places have a greater violence, where violence took place to a greater extent than elsewhere.
Well, in the 1992 election, Moi is re-elected. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
5 years on, the next general election, 1997. And you spoke a little about that yesterday. Just pausing there, is it right to say that the worst violence in 97 was in fact in Coast Province?
Yes. It was in 97. You had, well, the most media coverage of this tension because it was the coast, and the media were there as well, and there were around 100 deaths, 100,000 displaced persons. I don't know if we can compare the different tensions that there were in the country and make a competition with regards to the number of dead, but at the same time in Massabit you had 200 deaths, so it's not the only place by any means where there were tensions, but it was the tensions that received the most media attention, certainly. That's undeniable.
And Moi retires in 2002. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
That's after, 23 years or so as president.
Oui.
And he fell within the Kalenjin grouping, but he was himself a Tugen. Is that right? Tugen?
Oui.
Yes.
And again, as you touched on in your evidence yesterday, the Kalenjin as a whole, many of the groups felt that they hadn't benefited. Felt that they hadn't benefited as much as they fairly should have done during the Moi years. Is that right?
Yes, undeniably there was a frustration on the part of a lot of Kalenjin sub-communities. It was expressed through or by certain political leaders, but during the Moi regime, all these dissident voices were quashed by different means.
And essentially, the Moi inner circle was a Tugen Kayo, it's Keiyo, a Tugen Kayo grouping. Is that right? Yes.
Oui. That's it, yes.
And the 1990s, generally within Kenya, witnessed, and in particular in the North Rift, experienced degree of economic collapse. His was not an economic success, the Moi regime, was it?
Well, the North Rift is the cereal zone, and it's true that in the 80s the Moi regime tried to do the equivalent to what Kenyatta would try and do with coffee, namely to massively support the cooperative structures and other structures, and therefore, through different means, particularly by artificial price support, they tried to favour all the cereal sector, apart from the fact that it didn't work as well as they wished. And in the 90s, it is true that all the structures of organisation of this agricultural sector were collapsing. And so there's an agricultural economy which is suffering in that region.
Again, figures drawn from Daniel Branch, his book. In Uasin Gishu, Nandi and Bomet, absolute poverty levels in those places, Uasin Gishu, Nandi, Bomet, absolute poverty levels all increased from about 40 to 60% as a measure of that economic collapse. Do you again either familiar or accept those figures?
Oui.
Apart from oppression, and again I think Branch refers to there being in 1986 over 1,000 political prisoners under the Moi regime. Is that a figure that, again, you would accept?
Oui.
And Nyayo House, of course, in Nairobi, with its dungeons and torture chambers. Again, that's now well known, isn't it?
C'est bien connu, c'est très
Well known. It's very well documented.
And in the meantime, in terms of corruption, we know from the Kroll International report the extent of that corruption, or to a large extent we know the extent of that corruption, do we not?
Oui.
And the Kroll International report was only, in fact, published after the 2002 election. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
Kroll International, known, well, respected accounting investigatory organisation that was called in, demonstrated that the economy had been looted by him, that is Moi and his relatives, to the extent of just over $2 billion. Again, are those figures that you've become familiar with?
Oui,
Yes. There's clearly a criminalisation of the state during this period with major scandals, Goldenberg and other scandals.
To the extent that, and again I think this is, in fact, it is referred to in Gabrielle Lynch's article, that Gideon Moi is reputed to have benefit to the extent of £530 million, which is about $1 billion, and perhaps a bit less than that, and Philip by £384 million. Again, those are figures that you would have seen, and I dare say don't disagree with from what you've learnt.
Oui, c'est toujours des chiffres.
These are figures that circulate. It's difficult to demonstrate if it's more or less. Whatever the case, it's too much. Clearly too much.
Yes, well. After Moy retired, we had the 2002 election, which was, or so I understood from reading, was relatively peaceful. I don't know whether you want to revisit that figure of 350 killed that you mentioned yesterday. Can you help us as to that?
C'est les chiffres qui sont donnés.
These are figures that are given in particular in an article on violence. There's one or two articles about 2002 violence. These are figures that come up constantly. So these are the figures that must have been given by monitoring organisations or observer organisations that were observing the elections. And if you have peaceful elections, well, at the time I was in Kenya, and these were elections where there weren't major fears. They basically happened in a way, well, there was a good atmosphere, hope, a lot of hope.
Mr. Hooper, would this be a good time, perhaps you can do it yourself, to revisit whether or not the witness was able to do that homework of yesterday?
Yes, while we're on elections and the 90s into 2002, do you may recall that the bench invited you to see if we can come to a practical figure, as it were, that we can use or adopt?
Alors pour les années 90,
for the 90s, according to the figures that I have, around 400 deaths, but I really have to look at my archives. I only have handwritten sources. I don't have all my documents here, of course, but according to the sums that I've been able to make, it's around 400, 500 deaths, around that figure, but it's very unsatisfactory. I really have to go and check in the different reports that I have at home.
When you say in the 90s, we mean what?
97, the elections of 1997.
And did you also, your notes indicate displaced? The figure for displaced persons, if any, were displaced.
je n'ai les chiffres des déplacés.
I don't have the... Well, I only have the displaced figures for Mombasa. Mombasa, it's around 100,000.
Mais je sais qu'il y avait des déplacés en Transmara.
I know that there were displaced people in Transmara and other places, but I really have to see that in my other document.
With Moy gone, the National Rainbow Coalition won a stunning victory, and with it, everyone's hopes in Kenya, as indeed you've just said, their expectations were very high. Is that right?
Absolument.
Absolutely.
Though the Kibaki government did some good things, it didn't meet everyone's expectations. Is that right?
Non, bien sûr que non.
Of course, yes, of course not.
It pledged itself, for example, to fight corruption and to eliminate it. You've mentioned the Anglo leasing case of July 2004, and that, as I understand it, uncovered theft on the part of that regime of about $750 million in contracts. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
there was, as many said, a feeling nothing had changed under Kibaki. Is that right?
On peut pas dire ça.
You can't really say that. It wasn't the change that was expected, in that Kibaki went back to the same methods that previous governments had used. But there was a change, a major change compared to the Moi period.
That indeed was the case, but there were certain changes that created a sense of increased alienation, particularly amongst the Kalenjin people, but others also, as a result of various things that government did, some of which, of course, you touched upon in your evidence yesterday. First of all, there was extensive sacking, was there not, of Kalenjin civil servants. I understand about 100 top civil servants were sacked, Kalenjin civil servants. Is that right?
Oui, il y a eu une
Yes, there was a de-Kalenjinization at the higher levels of the government, of the state, just as Moi had Kikuyuized the public administration when he came to power.
Mr. Hooper, before you stray too far away from the area, since you talked about the Anglo-leasing scandal, and you've now put it on record as to what it means. The witness had also, in his report, and I believe in the course of the testimony, also mentioned the Goldenberg. What is that?
Yeah. The Goldenberg, was that largely the issues that were looked at in the Kroll report, Goldenberg?
Alors, le scandale Goldenberg.
The Goldenberg scandal was a financial scandal which was meant to finance the 1992 elections. It was a huge means of emptying the coffers of the state and use that money basically for the electoral campaign. That's basically what you can draw from the various reports. It had major macroeconomic effects, fueling inflation, and it was a horrific scandal for Kenyan finances. This took place in the early 1990s.
And it was after Moi had gone that the Kroll International investigation went into that and other similar thefts from the Treasury. That was the subject of that the Kroll report, the Goldenberg, as it's commonly known, and well known in Kenya. During the Kibaki first term, 2002-2007, you've spoken of this sacking of Kalenjin, a process of de-Kalenjinization, but it was also accompanied by a Kikuyuization. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
And there were then, of course, allegations of biased recruiting and appointments within government. The old partisanship of one ethnic group favouring its own.
Oui.
Yes.
And you spoke yesterday of particular incidents, the eviction of Kalenjin people from the Mao forest, which was the subject of an Amnesty International report, was it not?
J'imagine que vous faites...
Yes, you're referring to the Mau forest. The Mau forest is one of the largest forests in Kenya, and there are several areas, several zones that were given to groups that needed land. And during the Kibaki regime, the first regime, the illegal occupants were expelled from the forest, in particular the Kipsigis, and not only the Kipsigis, but mainly the Kipsigis. And some of this land was also given to well-known people, not just producers or farmers who benefited from this land, but there were Kalenjin leaders, community leaders, who benefited from this land, and others were expelled. And of course, this led to hard feelings on their part.
And a particular item of expected change, agreed change, as agreed between the National Rainbow Coalition Party members, was an expectation that the Constitution would be changed. Is that right?
Oui. Oui.
Yes, yes.
And the system as developed by Kenyatta and continued under Moi would to some extent revert back to the original federal constitution that had been dismantled by Kenyatta. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
And so when Daniel Branch, for example, says that this constitutional issue, this Majimbo issue, permeates Kenyan politics from its very beginnings as a state, independent state, right through to very recently, that's a very fair comment, isn't it?
Just one comment, Your Honor. Could we have the specific reference of these statements that Mr. Hooper is putting to the witness? In all fairness, I know we've gone through a couple of these already on other subjects, but on important and relevant topics, I'd like to have those references, obviously, so we can check and verify the information that's being put to the witness. And for the witness as well, it might be useful to have an excerpt of what's being put to him, because in certain cases there's a certain nuances or ambiguities, and if the witness is going to think, obviously, that it's something that comes directly from an author, then it should be exactly repeated to him as stated in the article or in the book.
Mr. Garcia, the technicality of objection is noted, but this is an expert, but Professor, do we have a danger that he would agree to a proposition that's put to him if he didn't agree with it? And the reason is, if Mr. Hooper phrases his question as it does, of course there are some consequences which perhaps you may explore at the time when he places references into his question. But what's more important, I take it, to be the proposition that is being put to the witness, regardless of the source of it, in the question, and then the witness can agree or disagree.
Indeed, Your Honor. The reason for my objection was basically I want the proposition that's put to the witness to be as clear as possible. In certain cases, on two cases, there's been certain nuances, ambiguities that the witness has come back on. That's the extent of my objection.
Mr. Hooper, you can proceed, but you may also, if you want to assist, I think you should be able to read out the references if that's not too unwieldy. for you, so that
be a bit
for the benefit of the
bit
record.
unwieldy. I mean, these are opinions, as Your Honour says, and we have an expert here. So here's an opinion that we have a seam, a Majimbo seam that runs through Kenyan politics. Whosever opinion that is, you'd agree with that?
Je dirais que la question
Well, I would say that the issue of Majimbo was discussed and was a major one up until 1964 and then receded from politics until the early 90s. It was dormant, if you will, throughout the Kenyatta regime and the first part of Ahab Moi's regime. It was something that came back in favor at the beginning of the multi-party system by Kalenjin officials in order to save the situation, if you will, if they were to lose the general elections.
Well, under the National Rainbow Coalition, there was a draft Constitutional Review Committee, was there not, that in fact proposed a constitution that reverted in many of its elements back to the original constitutional format, cutting down presidential centricism and providing more power to the provinces. Is that right?
exact.
That's correct.
But those proposals were chopped down by, it said in particular, the work of the then Attorney General, Amos Wako. Nothing to do with Wacky, of course. Wako, another personality, Attorney General. And he, that's right, he cut out a lot of the amending aspects of those proposals. Is that right?
Oui, c'est la... Oui.
Yes. The text of the Constitution that resulted from the meeting was not actually submitted to referendum. It was modified by WECO, the Attorney General, and it was worked on by the government in order to limit the federalism aspects. In other words, the text was completely denatured compared to what the original drafters of the Constitution had intended. Many of the politicians involved during the 2005 referendum were against that text because it did not correspond to the original drafters' intentions.
Mr. Hooper, you will need to spell the name of Amos Wako.
Certainly. Amos, A-M-O-S, Wako, W-A-K-O. And those are two words, of course. It's, first and second name. Who I think had been the Attorney General from 1991 right through until, I think, just 2 or 3 years ago. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
Well, with this denatured constitution that was now going to the people by way of a referendum for their agreement, because of the cut down, out of this came, of course, the Orange Democratic Movement. Is that right?
Pourriez-vous préciser?
Could you make that more precise, please? I'm not sure I understood your question.
Certainly. the denatured, I think was the word I used, which I had translated, the watered down, as it were, draft constitution was subjected to a referendum. And as we know, the Orange Democratic Movement was born, is this right, out of the opposition to that proposed watered down constitution.
Oui.
Yes.
And as you told us yesterday, all of Kenya, essentially, all the provinces, voted against the constitution, and only Central Province voted for it. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
And for Central Province, we are talking almost synonymously with Kikuyu. Is that right?
Oui.
Yes.
And so out of 42 tribes, 41 voted for, or rather against that constitution. One voted for it.
C'est un peu réducteur de le présenter de...
Well, to present it that way is a bit limited. What you can say is that the majority of the population voted against because 58% voted against. To say, well, you know, within the communities, there were people who voted for. Perhaps we can agree on that. 58% of the population voted against, which means the vast majority of the Kenyan people were against that constitution.
Very well. And after that referendum, Kibaki was left with mainly Kikuyu, Embu, Meru grouping supporting him. Is that right?
Ce que pensait l'opposition.
Well, that's what the opposition thought, but in fact, the polls indicated that his personal popularity was in fact higher than that, larger than that. The results of the election have shown that, in spite of everything, he had wider support than what appeared from the results of the constitutional referendum. Therefore, perhaps the people distinguish clearly between the issue relating to a constitutional referendum and the issue of a general election that was yet to come.
But as a political scientist, you'll be doubtless the first to agree that it's people's perceptions that often matter the most.
Oui, ça dépend.
Well, it depends. I'm afraid I'm not really sure what you're trying to get at. People's perception, what do you mean? You mean in terms of the legitimacy of the government in power, or what?
Let me give you an example. Perceptions, for example, that there was what was called the Mount Kenya Mafia, which you referred to. That was a perception. To what extent was it true?
Je trouve que...
Well, the fact is, Kibaki governed with a group of men around him, just as Ahab Moy also had a group of followers. Well, these Kamaria, these groups that influence the head of state, you could refer to a mafia, perhaps. But this term of the Mount Kenya Mafia was an expression developed by the opposition in order to denounce the fact that it was a very small group of men governing around Moi Kibaki. Did the people see it that way over and beyond what was stated in political circles? I really don't know, and I wouldn't really have anything to say about that.
Thank you. We mentioned Anglo-leasing as a token of corruption. You also mentioned the Artur brothers. What was that? That's A-R-T-U-R.
Oula, la saga des...
Well, the saga of the Artur brothers, well, it was a strange scandal. There were two Armenians, I seem to remember, who were very close with a person who had the reputation of being part of the President of the Republic's family, and thanks to that family link, they benefited from a series of advantages, facilities, and their name was connected with various types of trafficking. It was a scandal that was very much in the media for months, for several months, and it was typical, it was symptomatic of a regime that was more and more criminalized, as people said at the time. And so, yes, it was one of the scandals at the end of the first term of Kibaki.
And again, from what you say, it would be fair to say that there were those who took the view that that regime is now a profoundly criminal regime in its nature.
Par terme de crime...
Well, when I refer to the criminalization of politics, I mean in terms of the politics. We're referring here to practices whereby those who are governing do so outside of what is legal, and they do not respect the rule of law.
As far as state investment at the time was concerned, was that along regional lines? Was there again a favouring of certain areas over others, particularly central?
Faudrait regarder les chiffres.
Well, we'd have to take a look at the numbers. As far as I know, things were monitored fairly closely. I don't think there were very obvious excesses, if you will. One of the characteristics of that regime was that they did invest in infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure was situated in the capital city and near Central Province. But I don't recall the exact numbers. Given that you read Daniel Bunch's book recently, I believe they're in that book, but I'm afraid I don't remember them myself. But there's a lot of publications about that.
So as we come towards the election and into 2007, the ODM as a political party is structured. You've been through the various leading personalities concerned with ODM. Raila Odinga, representing the Luos, you told us. Salia Mudavadi, Luya. William Ruto as a Kalenjin. Najib Balala. Just pausing there, is he associated with a group or with it seems a place rather than a group? Is that right? With Coast? What's his position?
Vous voulez savoir qui est...
Your question is, who is Najib Balala?
Yes, I mean, what sector does
Alors,
he represent?
Najib Balala a été...
Najib Balala was the mayor of Mombasa. He was elected in a district of Mombasa, and he represents an urban area in the Coast Province, and he hoped to be the representative of the entire coast area, which is in fact divided into various different groups and communities, and it's a region that finds it very difficult to choose an uncontested leader. In ODM, Najib Balala, his role was to bring in the votes from the coast.
And Joseph Nyaga, Nyagah. GH. What sector did he represent?
Principe, il représente...
He represented the Embu, but inasmuch as Uhuru Kenyatta was not part of this arrangement, he was supposed to bring in the votes from the Jima. In other words, people from the central province, the Kikuyu and others. At least that was the hope of the ODM technocrats.
And Charity Ngilu?
Charity Ngilu, c'était Kamba.
Charity Ngilu was a Kamba, and she came in later into this alliance. The problem with the Kambas is that they had a major candidate in the presidential elections, Musyoka.
Mr. Hooper, it is now 12:30 on the clock. You had indicated you'd be done by lunchtime, I hope, with...
I said today, rather yesterday, I said I'd finish today, and this morning I said I hope to finish by lunchtime.
Yes, that's what I remember.
So it remains a hope.
We have a witness tomorrow. We need to start.
Indeed.
Yes.
But
Mr. King Katwa will also be going as well.
Yes. I'm fairly confident that the chamber nor the witness would be greatly inconvenienced by the further length, such as it be, of my discussion here.
You didn't account for Mr. King Katwa's own predicament in it. We wouldn't want to squeeze him.
No, you don't squeeze Nandi.
All right. Let's. What is your indication? Can you give us now?
I'm pretty on track.
For 12. For lunchtime.
It may go a little bit over lunch, but not much. And I'm very aware of the relative discomfort of the witness with his cough as well. So I'll press on. We were talking about the position of the ODM. And I think you can confirm that in no way did the ODM seek to exclude Kikuyu. It had Kikuyu activists also working in and for it. That's right, isn't it?
Oui, mais...
Yes, but when Uhuru Kenyatta was no longer part of this alliance, that reduced their contribution significantly.
Indeed, but that wasn't by way of policy, as it were, of the ODM. They would have preferred Kenyatta to have remained within their fold. And though Kenyatta went, it's right to say others remained.
Yes. You can't say that ODM had to just be read in ethnic terms. It did raise ideological questions, constitutional and other questions which were quite deep, in order to go beyond a whole series of ethnic divides in certain social milieu.
Musalia Mudavadi was essentially the Luya flag bearer. Can you just help us a little bit about the Luya? Let me put it like this: the largest single block, ethnic block, is the Kikuyu, is it not?
Oui.
And the next one, can you just, if you know the order, approximately?
Je me rappelle plus maintenant les
I don't remember the latest figures because it has changed. I don't want to. Well, let's say it's said that there are a series of groups that are numerically important. Who therefore have political force, strength, clear political force. Luo, Luya, Kalenjin, Kisii, Gamba, and the Luya. Now, the Luya, you're asking me what they were? Well, it's a bit like the Kalenjin, a relatively recent identity. You have very diverse communities joined together, and contrary to the Kalenjin, it's relatively divided up in its voting strategy. So you have a swing community which is essential to obtain an electoral majority. So they try and get their vote, but they do have an elite which is very disunited. And it's particularly complex to try and get a large number of voters from that community to vote for you. But they are a key demographic, politically and economically.
And of course, William Ruto, and you mentioned him yesterday, and you mentioned the Endama Ravine Declaration. And if we can just perhaps deal with that very briefly. Is it right that the Endama Ravine Declaration was essentially a political statement by Ruto, Mr. Ruto, whereby he was saying, I'm going to put myself forward as a presidential candidate in the forthcoming election? Is that right?
Oui.
And at Endama, he also received the support of several other MPs.
Oui. Oui.
And later, and quite separate and distinct, there was also a public show whereby he was appointed, or said to be appointed as a Kalenjin elder. Is that right? Took place in Eldoret, I think in June of 2006. So both events, quite distinct events, in 2006. Do you agree?
Oui.
Yes.
And in fact, he didn't do very well in terms of the presidential nominations for ODM. Is that right? I understand he picked up from all the nominating members, which was a large number, he picked up only 368 votes, not a very large amount at all. And the outright winner was Raila Odinga, who of course then became the presidential candidate in those elections.
How many votes?
I don't know. We can get that perhaps in due course. I don't have those figures. We might have them after lunch. But is it right that the Kalenjin people thought, and many MPs thought, it was too early to vote for Ruto because they didn't want to vote for one of their own. They thought after Moi it was too early. And they instead put their support behind Raila Odinga. Is that right?
Si votre interprétation...
It's your interpretation, but it is coherent. It's acceptable.
And so the Kalenjin are voting in 2007 for Raila Odinga, and in the same way as in 2002, persuaded by William Ruto, they threw their support behind Jomo Kenyatta.
Mm-hmm.
Uhuru Kenyatta.
Uhuru.
Oh, I'm sorry, Uhuru. Yeah, Uhuru Kenyatta. Very well. In fact, in November of 2007, Raila Odinga was made a Kalenjin elder.
We don't have the witness's answer to the question.
To the last question?
Yes.
Well, it was...
Oui.
And in November 2007, Raila Odinga also went through one of these public occasions when he dressed up and was said to be an elder of the Kalenjin people. Very well.
Oui. Oui.
Now, in terms of demographic pressures, one figure that I'd ask you to confirm, to give us, you may have mentioned it, I think, in your evidence, but I'm just making sure we've got it in. In 1950, the population of Kenya was 4 million, and today it's about 40 million. And that is, I understand, is that right, first of all?
Oui.
And I understand that is the fastest population growth ever recorded anywhere. Would you agree with that?
Le taux de démographie est
In terms
important.
of demography, it is very significant. Graphics.
So going into the 2007 election, for all the various things that and you've touched on in your evidence, as far as the ODM party was concerned, it's right, as you said, there were very high hopes and expectations as a result of its very youthful and positive and energetic campaign. Would you agree with that?
Oui.
Yes?
It included free secondary education as a promise. Is that right?
Oui.
Minimum social security for people, as I think you mentioned. Is that right?
Oui.
A more equitable distribution of resources. Is that
Oui.
right? A call by Raila Odinga for reversion to regionalisation, Majimbo federalism. Is that right?
Oui.
It offered a generational change as well. Is that right?
Oui.
And I suppose, like many politicians, but it placed a big emphasis, is this right, on increased employment and in particular addressing the huge problem of youth unemployment, which is just enormous in Kenya. Huge problem. Is that right?
Oui.
And there was, obviously, particularly amongst its supporters, a belief, a credible belief, that they were going to win that election. Is that right?
Oui, les sondages.
Yes. Well, what we have to explain, given the referendum, there was a wave of confidence in this opposition which grew. And it's true that this opposition was persuaded that it was going to win. And according to the polls, progressively, they confirmed this drive. Even if, according to the polls, it did indicate that it was going to be one of the most highly challenged elections, or the results would be, on both sides, it would be very close. But despite these polls which called upon people to really be careful, ODM were persuaded nevertheless that they were going to win. They were very confident that they were going to win.
Now, I'd like to just concentrate or discuss just a very little bit the final matter I wanted to raise with you, and that's to do with the elections themselves. 27th of December, we know, Kenya goes to the polls, big turnout, and as I understand it, as we understand it, I think from what we've heard, fairly early on, by the 28th, the constituency results have come in, that is, the parliamentary or National Assembly results. Is that right? And for whatever reason, whether it was bad organisation on the part of PNU or whatever, ODM was won by a landslide as far as the Parliament was concerned. Is that right?
Alors, complexe.
It's complex to the extent that, yes, PNU directly is only going to win a few constituency, 43 ODM. Well, if you add all the different seats of the different parties, the ones under PNU, you come to a figure which is much higher. If you add to that ODM Kenya, which very quickly joined the Kibaki camp, you come to a figure, well, a situation which is more or less egalitarian. Now, here we are talking about an election which is very close, extremely close. Now, with regards to the presidential or parliamentary elections, well, both sides rigged it, and the question is who rigged it more, and who had the means to rig it the most.
Can we clarify what was meant by egalitarian in the answer? Witness, what we heard was that if you added the figure, the parliamentary results figure for ODM Kenya, which had joined Kibaki, the transcript had you saying the results became more or less egalitarian. Do you mean to say more or less equal?
Je veux dire que...
Well, what I would say is that, well, there wasn't a clear majority that came out of it, but the two camps are 50-50, let's put it like that. And with the arrival of the ODM Kenya, then Kibaki, he had a small majority.
Just going back to parliamentary seats, you're a Kenyan sitting in your home in Eldoret or in a bar in Eldoret. You're watching this on television because this was all followed, wasn't it? Keen interest by people in Kenya. You nod. And of course we have identified Raila Odinga with ODM as the presidential candidate. And Kibaki, of course, with the PNU candidacy. Now, the PNU, in fact, vote more or less collapsed, did it not? They had about 40, how many seats, can you remember? Approximately. As opposed to...
43.
43, mais il faut expliquer.
43, but you have to explain 43 seats of members of parliament, but PNU is an alliance which is for the presidential elections, so all the parties...
Quite agree. So that's why we're taking it in stages. So we're talking about the parliamentary results that come in first. And so 43, PNU. What about ODM?
99.
89.
People in Kenya thought those elections were rigged, didn't they? Rigged by Kibaki. And I'm talking now about the presidential elections. That was the perception.
Il y a eu une perception.
Well, there was a perception which was quite common that there had been manifest rigging of it. This presidential election had been stolen. According to the polls, they're very precise. And I think you have to go back to the polls, but they indicated that about 60% of Kenyans considered that the presidential elections have been stolen. Well, the figures aren't absolutely reliable. Well, you really have to go back to the polls, but it's measured in a very precise way.
Mr. Hooper, can we get a figure for how many seats ODM Kenya have won?
99.
29.
No. ODM Kenya.
99.
99.
ODM, and then there's the sub-party, the divided, the ODM Kenya party.
The party that joined Kibaki, ODM Kenya.
Alors, ODM, c'est 99.
It's 99, but ODM Kenya would join the Kibaki camp, join the PNU camp. So you have to take off ODM Kenya, you have to discount that with the number of seats from PNU, from LACANU, well, from all the different parties that were members of the alliance, of the PNU alliance.
It's about 16. I might finish my
About 16.
Oui, c'est ça. Oui, c'est
there's
ça.
some other... Sorry, I think before you rest, you need to hear my question to see if you have some follow-up. Not on this. but something else.
All right.
So what we're trying to understand, witnesses, you had said that the PNU, you said that earlier, if you took the figure for PNU alone, it seemed that there was a great disparity. But I thought you said that if you added the seats won by ODM Kenya, which had joined Kibaki, one would see that in fact Kibaki's side had the preponderant number of seats. But now we're looking at a figure that shows ODM with 99 seats and PNU 43 seats. We're trying to make the math work according to your earlier thesis.
Alors, le PNU...
PNU, properly said, is the PNU. At presidential level, this is an alliance which is firstly made for the presidential elections, and it groups together 7 parties as well as other parties for the presidential elections. Now, with regards to the legislative elections, each of these 7 parties is separate, and this is where it becomes a bit complicated. Now, certain members of parliament were elected under the PNU banner, but most of the other party members of PNU presented their candidacy, and this gave a certain number of members of parliament. And so you have to discount or take away. When you look at the number of members of parliament who are in the same camp, you have to take away the members of the PNU, the KANU members, Ford People, the members of parliament from Ford Kenya, New Ford Kenya, Shirikishu, and so forth. And when you add up all that, these disparate parties, which de facto are on Kibaki's side, you see that there is a very small, very slight majority in the parliament accorded to Kibaki's camp, which, given that he was elected president, so there was a pressure to be able to convince members of parliament, and this means that ODM Kenya joined him. This was a strategy linked to the fact that ODM Kenya wanted to be alongside the person who held the executive. I don't know if I've been very clear with regards to the sort of parliamentary horse trading that was going on there.
Indeed, and that's the point. It was horse trading. It's post-election horse trading, and we're dealing with the actual election itself and perceptions. And all I want to bring out, and I think you agree, is that looking at ODM, their front-runner, Raila Odinga, looking at PNU, front-runner, Kabila, the man in the armchair watching this on the 28th of December sees a landslide going towards the Raila Odinga ODM and what appears to be a collapse on the part of PNU Kibaki. That's the perception that fuels this view at the time that it's a one-horse race on the 28th of December. 29th of December, delays in the votes coming in. This is accompanied, of course, by the comments of, for example, the European Union's election observers and the Kenyan Human Rights Commission observers and KIDOF, the other official observers, all voicing concern as to the Kibaki presidential count. That's right, isn't it? And is that right?
Pas clair du côté de...
Well, it's not clear on Kibaki's side, and it's not clear on the other side as well. But if you want to go back to the idea that, yes, in the results there was a massive degree of frustration on the part of a lot of people, and the explosions of violence which would immediately start after the results, that's based, yes, on the fact that there was a massive feeling of injustice in a lot of areas of Kenya.
Yes. Sorry, and in particular, I refer to, as I said, the European Union's election observers and the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, and many other commentators, contemporaneous with these events, expressing concern and manipulation of the Kibaki result. That's right, isn't it?
Oui.
Yes. It was known that there were problems in several different areas, but in particular on that side, yes.
And I think I can, if given just a few more minutes, conclude my questions. The overseeing body, of course, of these elections also was the Election Commission of Kenya, the ECK. It has 22 members. 19 of them were appointed by Kibaki in 2007. Is that right?
Oui. Sans consulter les partis d'opposition.
Consulting the opposition parties, which should have been done, and that weakened the legitimacy of this commission. And you have the ICG report on that. It explains it in great detail.
Indeed, and very critically, of course. And Ruto, who was the president of that commission, he described 9 of those appointees as, quote, riggers, R-I-G-G-E-R-S, riggers, vote riggers. Is that right?
Ignorait qu'il avait fait cette
Didn't know that he had made this statement.
In addition, just 2 days before the election, Kibaki appointed 5 High Court judges. And that was known, of course, at the time too. Is that right?
Oui.
On the night of the election, I don't know if you heard of this, the tallying centre in Nairobi, where the votes were being counted, was broken into. A burglary of something took place, even though it was, of course, cordoned off by the police. And that again was news that came out at the time. Someone had broken into the counting house in some way, despite the police presence. Again, something you heard or know about, is that right?
Il y a eu de sérieux problèmes.
There were serious problems, yes.
And all these things conspire together. And when eventually Kibaki is taken off to a darkening garden to be sworn in as the president for the second time on the night of the 30th, would it be fair to say, using Miss Muller's words, that Kenya was on the edge of a precipice?
Oui.
The depth of that precipice, the extent of it, no one saw at the time there. We all look back now with the benefit of hindsight, don't we? But people at the time didn't realize the extent of what was about to happen. And it was a surprise and a shock, not just in Kenya, but all over. And that's right, isn't it?
Oui.
It has to be said that the way in which it was organised, well, this gave rise to a lot of mistrust, and the results, well, a lot of people considered that the official results were illegitimate, the way in which the tally was done. So when it comes to this tallying, it had a really bad effect, it gave the impression that votes had been stolen. Now, afterwards, there was a commission. Well, how did it effectively take place? There was an official commission which was organised. There were investigations that were carried out, and what came out of the work, which wanted to be as neutral and objective as possible, explained that there had been manifest rigging, and it was done on both sides. Now, the official report carried out within the framework of the post-crisis situation said you couldn't say who had actually won. We can't know. But what has to be seen is that at the time, at the end of the year, there was such a scenario at the time with regards to the tallying that there was this feeling that, yes, there had been rigging. They'd been ripped off somehow. And in the major cities, young people who were revolting, they reacted very strongly against these results, and they judged those results, that election, to have been stolen.
Ruto, 1 second.
And that,
Mr. Ruto, may I please, before you move on, witness in all of that. Today you had testified at the point when counsel was cross-examining you as to whether there was a change between the regime before Mr. Kibaki's and his own, and you said it's not a very simple matter, and you did say that there were some infrastructural developments under him, and that he maintained a high popularity among the population. Was that your testimony? If that was the case, would it have anything to do with the analysis or the outcome of the result, in your view?
Well, there's no doubt that the Kibaki regime did a number of things. There was economic growth, he developed infrastructure, and it's true that he organized a free primary education, and according to the polls, he, as a person, had a very high level of popularity. So, in spite of the cheating and the rigging in the elections, it is known that, in fact, this election was the closest ever in the history of Kenyan elections up until then. And that was the problem. It was a new phenomenon that it be so close and that it be so unclear. In 2002, 61% of the population voted for Kibaki. There was no question about the results. Whereas here, it was extremely close, 50-50. And that's why the whole issue of rigging was an important one, to see which side things were going to go. And that was the important role of the administration.
Leave it there and take it up.
just one more question.
Can we?
Only one more question.
And that will be the end
Yes.
for you. Okay.
And it's really a proposition. Simply, sorry. Of course, there's been another election since 2013. Right? As one understands it, there was little or no violence associated with that. Is that right?
Il y a eu très peu de violence.
Yes, very little violence. It was organized very peacefully. And the stakes involved in this very court was one of the factors contributing to the pacification of politics.
Yes. Though Miss Lynch opines that it may also be a dysfunctional factor in Kenyan politics. Isn't that right?
C'est-à-dire?
What exactly do you mean? Could you perhaps make that a bit clearer, please?
That this process will increase at least a sense, for example, of amongst a Kalenjin group of persecution, for example.
Vous parlez de ce processus.
What process are you talking about? What are you talking about?
ICC trials.
Ah oui. C'est l'avis de...
Well, that's the opinion of Madam Lynch.
Indeed.
We'll leave it there and come back.
Yes, thank you. Can I say this? I've no other questions, at least at the moment. Dr. Mopo, thank you very much for answering my questions and the courtesy you've extended to me in doing so. Thank you very much.
We will rise and come back at 2:30.
All rise a little bit.